I wasn't lacking opportunity. I was really lacking focus and clarity. And instead of saying, what else can I do? I got to ask myself the question, what's most important right now? Complexity is part of the job. It always will be. But confusion is something that we have responsibility for.
Easy to blame effort or to blame attitude most of the time. It's a clarity problem. And if I'm able to clarify that well, we're going to be able to hit the mark. It's not simplification. It's just that removal of ambiguity. As leaders, if our people are confused, that's on us. You're listening to the Elevate Your Call to Service podcast.
Here, law enforcement leaders gain practical tools to lead proactively in a reactive profession so they can communicate clearly, strengthen internal trust, and stay grounded in their call to serve.
I'm Mike McIntosh, a retired sheriff and current division chief with nearly 4 decades in law enforcement leadership.
And I'm Kathy McIntosh, a business and branding strategist and longtime law enforcement wife. I focus on the human side of leadership, communication, identity, and the internal dynamics that impact performance and trust across an organization.
Together, we combine real-world command experience with clear, actionable leadership conversations.
So you can lead with intention, build stronger teams, and elevate your call to service.
Well, welcome back to Elevate Your Call to Service. We're so glad that you're here. You know, one of the things that I really enjoy about just going on some road trips with you is we get an opportunity to get into some different types of conversations. And sometimes the longer the road trip, the longer the conversations. And it's one of the times where we can just shut everything off and we can really talk about, you know, what's going on in your business and what's going on in my business and what's going on with our podcast. And just this last week was kind of one of those times that we were able to really just kind of slow down and start to have a conversation. And that conversation kind of led to clarity, which is going to be the topic of our podcast. We were able to really kind of look at ways that it really applies to leadership. But you told kind of a story of the way that you've been navigating your business recently and kind of where you're at now. And one of the things that I really appreciated about that story is just you finding clarity in where it is that you wanted to go and take your business.
Yeah. I have way too many ideas to execute, and I'm a collector of ideas, and I get really excited about something. And I want to run as fast and as far as I can down that road. And then, squirrel, I get a different idea and I start running in a different direction. And it gets really confusing and it gets really heavy. So I came to a point where I had too many irons in the fire. I had a bunch of different directions I could go. The podcast, of course, we knew we wanted to do. I love to teach. I wanted to do courses. I definitely coach people. I love that. I love to do writing. I wanted to do a membership. And I just kept trying to move all of them forward at once. And it was chaos. Yeah. And nothing was getting done well. Everything was just being dabbled in. And I told myself that I was doing what I was supposed to do. I was, executing on all of my gifts. But honestly, I was just being pulled in too many directions and it was draining and I just felt exhausted and completely overwhelmed. And then the shift really happened when I realized I wasn't lacking opportunity. I was really lacking focus and clarity. Clarity. So confusion to clarity, right? And I felt very prompted to choose just one lane and go all in. That didn't mean for me that I had to give up everything else permanently, which I needed because I do like to hold on to all of those ideas. But it meant that I could just simplify. And instead of saying, what else can I do? I got to ask myself the question, what's most important right now?
Yeah.
And let's just go on that road and go, as I said, all in. And within a few weeks, I felt like I finally had more traction than I'd had in months. Instead of spinning my wheels, I was actually starting to make some progress and to see some things happening.
Yeah.
So in my life, there was a really big shift from confusion and overwhelm to clarity and focus.
When you were telling me that, it just brought so clearly to a lot of those things that we do in law enforcement, a lot of those things that we do in leadership. And to me, I like to use the term operational clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times that we really have to make sure that we stop long enough so that we can start to put all of those things that we need to do or that we want to do into simple steps, prioritized steps. Not that we're not going to do them, but just making sure that we are out of all of that chaos that's going on. There's chaos on tactical crime scenes. There's chaos in administration. There's multiple different things that are coming at us all the time. And we really need to make sure that operationally that we are delivering a message to those that are around us, those that we're in leadership positions of, that we bring a clear, simple message to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to kind of unpack that in this episode, because the reality in all of that is that in law enforcement, it can be a very complex job.
Most of the time it is.
And it's always going to be that way.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and I just want to clarify too, because I don't want any of our listeners thinking that you're coming from a place where your entire agency is filled with chaos. That's not it at all. It is the complexity of the profession.
Right.
And it's also just how many balls you have to put in the air at one time. And there's just always, always, always a lot going on.
Yeah.
So it's not completely disorganized chaos. It's just, as I said, the nature of the profession where
Right.
there's just a lot of plates spinning in the air at any one time.
Right. And as leaders, we have vision. We have mission. There's things that we want to be able to do. We always talk about being proactive. So we're constantly thinking of these things, and we can get stuck in that I've got so many things that I want to do that I'm not taking the time to prioritize them and really bring operational clarity around it so that we can accomplish all of those, but we're going to accomplish those well.
Mm-hmm. And you like to say complexity is part of the job. It always will be. But confusion is something that we have responsibility for. We can either create it or eliminate it as
Right.
leaders.
Yes.
And it's something that we need to work on. And organizational clarity goes hand in hand with some of our foundational principles for integrated leadership development. And that's one of those is clear communication, because when clarity is missing, not only in communication, but also in organizational methods, everything else starts to break down.
Mm.
Everything else starts to go a little haywire. So that organizational clarity, as you like to call it, is absolutely critical in keeping productivity moving forward and keeping an organization sound and unified and pressing on toward the goal
Right.
that we're trying to accomplish.
Right. I would say that we've all seen it. And if we're honest, and I'm being totally honest, I've been and I've seen others that start to be a part of that, a part of that confusion. You'll see it in different teams that are working hard, but they're not working in the same direction. They're not moving together. And then, of course, there's times that people can become unsure of what their priorities are or what their supervisor's priority is. You see it in leaders stepping in too often because things aren't moving, so they're going to try to fix it, right? And then it starts to run into micromanagement, and that just leaves frustration for those that are in the unit, for those that are on the team. And when that starts to creep in, that can be something that starts to drive that wedge. And now we have units that are frustrated instead of supporting each other. And it's really easy to blame effort or to blame attitude or even capability. But most of the time, it's none of those. Most of the time, it's a clarity problem.
We're going to break this all down today and leave our listeners hopefully with some practical steps on how to move forward and how to make sure that there is organizational clarity. By the end of our time together today, we hope that you're going to walk away with a clear understanding of what operational clarity is and what it looks like, the real consequences of operating without clarity and finding that confusion and what feels like inner turmoil, and most importantly, how to build clarity across teams and units and throughout your organization so people can act with confidence instead of hesitation.
Yeah.
So how would you describe, and I think that you've kind of gone into it a little bit already, but what does organizational clarity actually mean specifically for a law enforcement leader?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's that clarity of mission and that clarity of priority so that everybody on the team knows, they know what the mission is, and we're real clear about that. And we know the priority of the things that we want to be able to accomplish. And I think that the other key to that, and sometimes the one that we miss out on, is what does success look like? If we're doing those well, what does success look like to me? And if I'm able to clarify that well, we're going to be able to hit the mark. It's not simplification. It's just really that removal of ambiguity. This is where execution is the goal, clarity is the enabler. If they hesitate, that's when we know. If there's hesitation there, then it's unclear. They're not clear in that message.
Or the mission or the assignment or the priorities.
Or even what success looks like.
And where do you see that organizational clarity break down in the organizations that you've worked with?
Like we talked, there's usually a lot of things that go on in law enforcement, in the different divisions and the roles that we have, and more coming at us every day. There's this theory out there that we have to be great multitaskers. And sometimes that gets us into trouble because you'll start to see that breakdown when there's competing priorities, or you'll start to see it in an inconsistent message. So I'm saying one thing today, but tomorrow when we come in, the message that I'm talking about is not consistent with what I said yesterday. And that starts to really break that organizational clarity down. And then there's overly complex directives, statements that don't need to be that way. That starts to bring confusion. And I would, I would say that when everything matters, nothing moves. And it's kind of going back to your story, right? All of those things that you talked about were important. All of those things we had talked about and how important they are. But you have to break it down. What are we going to work on first? How are we going to set that mission? How are we going to set those priorities? How are we going to define success? That's how we can start moving forward.
That's so good. That's so good. And sometimes leaders unintentionally create confusion. And this is one of the very hard parts about communication, because you know what you're trying to get at. You know your point.
Right.
But when it comes out of your head through your mouth, it doesn't always hit the mark. And you think that you've said something clearly, but you really left out steps, 6 through 10.
Right.
Because you know them so well, you think everybody else is just going to automatically pick up on that. And So it's unintentional. No
Yeah.
leader walks in and says, "I think I'm going to confuse my team today." So what are some examples of that?
Well, I think kind of to your example right there, sometimes the opposite is also true, right? We can over explain everything, put way too much in there. And then again, we've got this big old long explanation,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes very unclear
Mm-hmm.
because it's just a confusing explanation. And we really need to prioritize instead of over explaining things. And then once again, trying to solve everything at once.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that. You've got to take those in bite-sized pieces, and you've got to work on them and then move on to the next one. Again, going back to that prioritization. I think that the one that I see happen most of the time, and I think that leaders get caught in it, is because you know exactly what's going on in your head.
Mm-hmm.
You just, after you explain it, you assume that people have understood what your intent was, or what the point you're trying to get across, and you just leave it there instead of verifying that you were clear in your message.
So there's the assumption, but in reality, that's not how it went down.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Let me ask you something. When your teams talk about your leadership, what do you hope they say? Trust isn't automatic. Respect isn't inherited with rank. Both are built intentionally. Many sergeants and lieutenants are carrying more responsibility than they were ever formally prepared for. And many are wondering whether they're truly ready for the next step. Coaching creates space to slow down, reflect, and lead on purpose. We've seen leaders restore unity in divided teams. We've seen aspiring leaders step into promotions with steady confidence. If that's the kind of intentional growth that matters to you, go to leleaders.com and schedule a conversation. We'll meet you where you are, and we'll build a plan that fits your role and your goals.
What's the connection? And I know there's a very big connection between clarity and confidence.
I would say for most people, clarity is going to breed confidence. Because if I feel like I understand and I'm very, very clear, I can be confident moving forward in what the next step is. If my boss is very clear, I can be confident in carrying out what it is that my boss wants me to carry out. And really that's what is one of those things that makes a great leader, is somebody who can make things clear. They have clear expectations. Once those expectations are clear, that brings decisive action. Unclear expectations, that starts to leave you second guessing. And not only is it, I'm not real clear on what's going on, but is that that wasn't explained well? Or do I lack the skills and the abilities to carry that out? So it's just kind of that lack of confidence now because those expectations are unclear. Confidence doesn't come from experience alone. It comes from clarity. I think that that's a very important concept that we need to be aware of.
And the opposite of clarity then is the confusion. And
Yeah.
where there is confusion, just as in my story, it multiplies stress.
Yeah.
It creates burnout. People feel like they can't win. They start to focus on things that aren't going well. Their energy's drained. I'm just explaining my own situation. There's a lot of frustration. Something that you talk about, though, is commander's intent. And I would like you to just kind of unwrap how that all fits together. Explain what commander's intent is. How does it impact organizational clarity?
Yeah, and that goes back to when we were originally talking about mission and purpose and what success looks like. Really, that's a commander being very clear on all of that to include what success looks like. So the commander's intent is, this is what we are doing. This is why it matters, which is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, again, this is what success looks like. And if you can't answer that, then the intent is failed. If I ask them to repeat that back and they can't answer that, then I've failed in giving the commander's intent.
So again, it's how the commander communicates his intent and whether it's understood by a team or not. And there are a lot of different practices that contribute to organizational clarity. Communication is one of those. How do you, as a leader, ensure that communication brings the clarity that's needed?
I think that it's, first, it needs to be short and it needs to be repeatable. When I first learned about commander's intent, I went back to my SWAT days, and when we would go through an ops plan, when we would talk about what it is that we were going to do and what my role was in that, we would actually go around the room and each person then would repeat what their role was, what their job was, how they were going to, react to the stimulus that that they ran across. And to me, as now in my later years as the commander, what that provides me is knowing that message is very, very clear. If we do that with our teams, that's what we did for a tactical exercise, but there isn't any reason why we can't do that when we're just, talking about a project that we're working on. That allows us an opportunity to be an opportunity that we know that our expectations were communicated clearly.
And you could do that even in the format of a stand-up meeting where you don't have to talk about it for an hour. It's just, hey, gather around the coffee maker.
Right.
Let's pour the coffee while we just reiterate who's doing what.
Right.
Let's just provide an update and make sure that we're all on the same page and there's no overlap and nothing's being ignored or overlooked.
Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that. And there's been one person or that I was going to say got it wrong. They didn't get it wrong. They didn't understand what was explained, or they were completely left out of it unintentionally, right? And that quick little check-in made sure that we're all on the same page. We're all moving forward in the same direction.
That's the communication piece of it. What about maybe a policy or a procedure piece? How does that work together with organizational clarity?
Yeah. So when we're talking about carrying something out, I like to work in frameworks as opposed to rigid procedures. And I like to work that way because things aren't always going to play out exactly the way that you planned them. And if you're in a rigid procedure, when that next step that you take it didn't work out the way that it was planned, the problem is then there's either hesitation or there's a complete lack of movement. In our profession, that can be very, very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you work within a framework and you have commander's intent, this allows that adaptability, because it may not work out or it's playing out the way that we thought it was going to, but we know what success looks like, so we can keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
We adapt to what it is that we just faced, and then what we say is we conquer, right? Or we overcome.
Mm-hmm.
We adapt and overcome. We adapt and conquer. And it really starts to support that empowerment of your people. You put the expectations out, and then you empower them to do what it is that they need to do to make sure that commander's intent is followed and that they know what success looks like.
What does it look like when alignment across different units starts to break down?
Well, we've talked in past podcasts, we've talked about silos, and that's one of the things that really starts to surface to the top. Units are no longer working together, and they become protective of their own separate divisions. That communication starts to break down, and there's times that happens unintentionally. And we've talked about really how that starts to fracture the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what that really starts to produce. And that's not a direction that we want to be going.
So if there was one mistake that you could encourage a leader to stop making, what would you say that is?
It kind of goes back to your original story, right? Let's not continue to add more instead of focusing on what we have, right? Stop adding and start clarifying.
And if we're going to make this practical, because obviously none of this matters if it doesn't change how we behave, we have to have an application point. So what would be your leadership challenge? What would our listeners be able to do immediately this week to start at whatever level they're in, bringing some more organizational clarity?
I think it's the ask back. Start asking your team members, what are our top 2 priorities right now? What are we working on? And what does success look like?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know that we've met our goals? How do we know that we're ready to move on to the next thing? And if you're asking the team that, and you start to get, let's say you ask 3 people and you get 3 different answers,
Mm-hmm.
you know that
That's a signal to a leader.
it's a signal to a leader that we have not been clear,
Sure.
And that we need to go back to ensuring that we resolve that clarity problem that we have.
Good. And that's really simple, but extremely effective. And just figuring out where your team is. What do they know?
Yeah.
You know what you think you've said.
Right.
How did they hear it?
Right. I mean, it just sitting here talking about it, there's times that you're like, man, I'm failing in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so easy to do because we get so busy, and the more we're with a team, the more we kind of know the team. And there's times that you just assume that they're off doing what it is that you think that they're doing. And every once in a while, we just need to do that. We need to do that check-in, because they're not, I'm not saying that they're doing something wrong.
Inappropriate.
Or inappropriate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They totally feel like they're moving in the direction that you've asked them to. But we need to, we need to do that check. And that's a great, very quick check, whether it's a project we're working on, whether it's an operation we're getting ready to go out and do, whether it's just your like my commanders, what are the top 2 priorities that we're working on in your unit? Because we've had those conversations, and now it's just checking in and making sure that we're aligned.
I feel like this is one of those things that when you get it right, you're going to start to see things shift and improve pretty rapidly, which is very exciting. People start to act with more confidence. Teams start to work together. They're more unified. There's a lot less friction, a lot less stress. Organizational clarity, I don't think we can overemphasize this, is a leadership responsibility that can absolutely make or break the objectives of performance within that agency. Clarity drives confidence. Clarity drives alignment. Clarity drives connection. And all of that points to better, more complete, more appreciated by a community type of performance.
When you go back and you start to look at high-performing teams, teams that are very successful, when you look at, SEAL teams, or you look at championship football teams or baseball teams, there's operational clarity around everything that they do. There's a person that is responsible for a role. That person knows what the expectations are. They know what the mission is. They know what success looks like. And they know what their job in all of that is, and they're moving towards that goal.
That's great. So we've talked about what organizational clarity is. We've talked about the consequences of not having it. And we've given just a few practical steps of how to create it or improve it.
Yeah.
Agency-wide.
In closing, I just want to kind of bring it back and just let the listeners know that complexity is inevitable. It's going to happen.
For sure.
In our role, it's there. But you made the comment at the beginning of the podcast that confusion is optional. And sometimes we don't pay attention to it. And we really need to. As leaders, if our people are confused, that's really on us. That's not on them. That's on us, because we're the one delivering the message. But when we create clarity, we don't just improve performance. We give our people the confidence that they need to act when it matters most.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you again for such a great talk. And thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Elevate Your Call to Service. Right.
I'm recording.
If today's episode added value, don't let it end here.
Share it with someone on your command staff or leadership team, because strong leadership isn't built in isolation.
And if you're ready to develop or become proactive leaders inside your organization,
leaders who communicate clearly and strengthen internal trust,
then visit leleaders.com to learn more about our coaching programs, workshops, and keynotes.
And if the podcast has been helpful, we'd appreciate your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Until next time, lead with clarity, lead with conviction, and elevate your call to service.